Have you ever been listening to one of your favorite bands and thought, that is an incredible sounding snare drum? And then listened to some of your own music or recordings and thought, why doesn't mine sound like that? In today's video, I'm going to cover a wide variety of variables that go into creating the snare drum sound of your dreams. So stick around, all that and more is coming right up. This is The Sound Co, and my name is Byron, and thank you so much for joining me today. On this channel, we cover a wide variety of music production tips and tricks, mix tutorials, and all types of things for creative people in the music industry. So if you're a music producer, you're a songwriter, an artist, or a mix engineer, there's something for you. So make sure you hit the little red subscribe button just down here. I think it's down there. Wait a sec. Yeah, it's down there. Okay, so on to today's topic, recording the snare drum. It's actually one of the most challenging things to get right in a drum recording. There's a lot of different ways that you can actually do it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna be covering drum selection, drum tuning, drum treatment, microphone technique, placement, and the mix process. A snare drum sound actually has the power to define the genre of music that you're playing in. So whether you're playing rock, pop, funk, or jazz, there's a sound for every style. So knowing how to get the snare drum sound that you're looking for is very important for a recording engineer and even a drummer. So the first thing that we're going to need today is obviously a snare drum. Now in today's video, you're probably wondering why we haven't got the rest of the kit in front of us. That's because I just wanted to show you guys the snare completely by itself. Because there's so many different things that go into recording a great sounding snare drum, I wanted to completely focus just on this drum. Now the first point that I'm gonna make when wanting to record an incredible sounding snare drum is actually selecting a quality instrument itself first. If you've got a good quality drum set and it's well tuned, then half the battle of achieving a great sound is actually done for you. Now you might not have a large selection of drums, and to be honest with you, I actually borrowed this off a drummer friend of mine. They're actually quite expensive drums, the Brady thing, so I'm gonna do my best to look after it for you, mate. Now if you're a drummer or a recording engineer and you've got a session coming up, but you're not sure that your snare drum that you own already is gonna cut it when it comes to your recording, or it's not what you're looking for in terms of the style that you're trying to achieve, then go out and hire something. There's so many hire places around town that will actually do you a really good deal on hiring a drum for a day. It means that you don't need to go out and spend $1,000 on a custom-made wood hoop snare drum. For say 50 bucks, you could hire a really high quality snare drum for a day and use that in your session. So the first point is definitely making sure that you have a quality instrument at hand. My second point when it comes to getting a great sounding snare drum recording is to drummers. Hit the thing well. A really large part of getting a great snare drum sound, and in general an overall great kit sound, it comes down to who's actually hitting the thing. You have to hit this thing well, and you have to hit it consistently. Sometimes when I've recorded less experienced drummers, they're hitting the center of the drum, but then they're also hitting the side of the drum, or maybe they're hitting a little bit too much rim. And what ends up happening on your recording is you get this really varied, uneven snare drum sound in your recording, where really what you want is a drummer that is going to hit right down the middle all day, every day, achieving a sound that is going to be consistent. So drummers, remember, a lot of the sound that we're trying to capture is actually up to you and how you hit the drums. It's going to make a massive difference to the overall sound of your drum recordings. So we've got drum selection, drummer skills, and my next point is drum tuning. The way you tune a snare drum, whether it be high, somewhere in the middle, or really, really low, like I said before, it actually determines the style of music that you're playing. If you're playing in a funk band, it's quite likely that you're going to have quite a high tuned snare with a lot of overtones. Whereas if you're playing in a rock band, you probably want something that's in that low to mid-range tuning with not too much overtones. However you choose to tune your drums is up to you really, but what I would say is make sure you're tuning your drums to suit the style of the song that you're working on. My fourth and final point about the drum itself is treatment. Knowing a few techniques and tricks that you can do to treat your snare drum before you ever put a microphone near it is going to help you get a lot closer to achieving the sound that you've got in your head. So here's a few things that I've brought in to show you today when it comes to treating a snare drum before we've actually mic'd it up. The first treatment technique that I'm going to recommend to you guys is a little thing called moon gels. Most drummers will understand what these things are already. They're these tiny little bits of blue jelly that you stick on the sides of your snare drum. And what that does is actually helps to kill the overtones So if you've got a very ringy snare drum, you can put moon gels around the edge of it, maybe 2 or 3, depending on how much of the ring you actually want to kill. Moon gels are a really cheap and effective way to dampen the overtones of the entire kit. So you could use them on the snare, and you can also use them on your toms as well. Okay, my next little trick for treating a drum before we've actually mic'd it up is good old gaffer tape. Holds the world together. Gaff is another cheap and effective way to dampen the overtones of your snare drum. And it's also a really cool way to get a really niche taped up sound. So you could put tape right across the snare drum or maybe the toms, and you get a really short, very punchy sound. Now, my favorite little technique for treating the snare drum before we've mic'd it up, and the technique that we're going to use in today's video, is using a little something called the big fat snare drum. And they're so easy to use. You literally just whack them on the skin and straight away, it's killed all these overtones. It's quite long, or there we go. That's just camera audio, and we obviously need to put some microphones in place. We're going to talk a lot about microphone placement. What I'm also going to do is go into depth about the top snare microphone position and how moving that around to various different spots on the drum is going to give you a really different tone depending on where you place it. The trusty SM57 by Shure is quite well renowned as the world's industry standard when it comes to miking up a snare drum, because snares just sound like snares through a 57. So that's why we're using this today, because it's just the most well-used microphone for miking up a snare. Easy. So first we're going to start by placing the snare drum microphone just over the edge of the rim of the drum. And I'm going to imagine, like, if there was the rest of the kit in play, like the hi-hats might be sitting here, and you'll have a tom and another tom sitting over here and a ride cymbal. So I'm going to angle the microphone just like I would if I was miking up an entire drum kit. Like I said, I'm just going to place this microphone just over the rim of the drum, and we're pointing right towards the center of the skin. Okay, our first microphone is in play now. So we've got a big fat snare drum donut over the snare, and this is what the one microphone sounds like. Now, if I was to take away the big fat snare drum, here's what it sounds like without it. As you can hear, it's quite a lot of overtone going on, but as soon as we get this, it's a nice, big, warm, fat sound. Let's try the same thing, but with the moon gels. The dampening effect isn't going to be quite as dramatic, but it might just get rid of some of the long, ringy overtones on this. One moon gel either side of the microphone. Let's see how this sounds. Still quite ringy. Maybe this one needs more. Let's do 4 moon gels. A little note just about the big fat snare drum technique in dampening is that you can actually achieve exactly the same effect by taking a snare drum head and placing it on top of your existing snare. So all you really need to do is cut out the ring around the edge of it and then tape it to the snare. So if you've got an old snare drum skin, don't throw it away. Literally just cut the ring out of it. You could cut a hole in the center of it if you really wanted to, and just tape it onto your drum. Okay, so let's talk a little bit deeper about microphone position. The top snare mic is the most important microphone when it comes to capturing this sound. Other microphones that are going to come into play a little bit later will be a snare bottom and also a mono overhead. But for now, just with this one microphone, we can vary the sound of the snare that we actually capture just by moving this to different places. So as you see, the first position is just over the rim and we're pointing at the center of the drum. This would be my personal starting point when I mic up a snare drum. What I do is I place it right here just above the rim. I'm literally about 1.5 inches away from the top of the rim, pointing at the center of the drum. And if that doesn't sound good, then that's when I start to move things around. But if I place it there and it sounds good, then I'm just going to go with it, because the reality is in a recording session, things need to move quite quickly. If you have a go-to microphone position when it comes to miking up any instrument, use that technique. And then if it's not quite sounding right still, that's where you can start to tweak things slightly. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten the mic and bring it down a little bit closer to the rim. And I'm going to place it just outside of the actual snare drum ring. And this technique is going to be great because it's going to actually pick up a little bit of the sizzle from the snare bottom as well as the crack from the top. So let's see how that sounds. So now we're going to move the microphone, keep it quite flat, still pointing towards the center of the snare, but now we are almost a centimeter away from the rim. So we're going to lose a little bit of the high end that we had from the snare bottom there. We're going to get a lot more crack out of this snare drum sound because we're sitting very close to the wood hoop. Need to tape that down. Just stick a tiny bit of tape. And now keeping the microphone on the same angle, let's move it even further inside, about 1.5 inches over the rim now. And this sound is going to pick up a lot more of the weight of the skin. Cool, so there's 3 microphone positions that will vary the sound of the snare drum. Now what I want to do is lift the microphone up a little bit higher and point it down towards, still down towards the center of the drum, but now we're going to get a little less of the actual crack of the snare drum sound. We're going to get a lot more of the low, deep mids. Another spot that can be quite cool for a snare drum sound is right on the side of the drum itself. So if I lower this microphone down, as far as I can get it, we're going to get a blend of the top and a lot more of the bottom now. So as you can hear, just moving that snare top microphone to various different positions and angles, heights, and also where it's placed in relation to the rim of the drum is going to yield a massively different sound. So depending on what style, depending on what kind of sound you have in your head that you're trying to capture, there's a few different ways that you can use one microphone to get a great different sound across the kit. As I said before, my favorite and default position for a snare top microphone is usually sitting about 1.5 inches over the rim of the drum, pointing down towards the center of the drum. So I'm going to get quite a lot of warmth from the top skin, and I'm also going to get a lot of crack and attack from the rim of the drum itself. A couple of other microphones that are going to come into play for today's recording is a snare bottom microphone and a mono overhead. For the snare bottom, again, I'm just going to use an SM57, and it's really important to remember that you need to flip the polarity of your microphone, which basically is another way of saying flipping the phase around, because when we have 2 microphones that are pointing towards each other, what's going to end up happening is when the sound waves hit that microphone, there's going to be a positive and a negative side to that sound wave. And when those 2 microphones that are pointing at each other hit the same sound wave, they're actually going to cancel one another out. So you need to make sure that you flip the polarity on your snare bottom microphone. Positioning the snare bottom microphone, I like to try and align it just underneath where my snare top microphone is going. So if I have a look, we're not far from the resonant head at all. We're about 1.5 inches again, trying to line up this microphone with the top one. And the final microphone that we're going to put into place is a mono overhead. So the mono overhead microphone we're using today is an AKG 414. It's a large diaphragm condenser, quite commonly used as an overhead microphone. I really like the sound of this mic, and what it's going to do is it's going to pick up a different type of image of the snare drum. So we've got our top microphone, our bottom microphone, and our overhead doing the work, all to pick up a different type of sound from this snare drum. Our top microphone is doing the main job when picking up the sound, which is going to pick up the fatness of the skin and the crack of the rim. And then our bottom microphone is picking up the actual snares themselves. So that's going to pick up the sizzle and the snap of the snare drum. Now, I don't always use a snare bottom microphone when it comes to recording an entire drum kit. What I can sometimes do is put a little bit of 10K into the top microphone, and that gives me the sizzle that I'm looking for from the snare drum. But each to their own. Some people use it a lot, and then some people don't. If you've got the microphones and the preamps available, I would say it's always a good idea to mic up the snare bottom. But again, I personally don't always do it, as I don't always find it to be necessary for every style of drum kit that I record, but if you've got the facilities to do so, it's worth doing. Now, the overhead up top, we're just doing a mono overhead today. What I would normally have is a mono overhead and a pair of stereo microphones picking up the entire kit, but just for today's demonstration of this one snare drum, I'm using just a mono overhead. And what that's going to do, that's going to pick up a different type of image as well to what these close microphones are picking up. We're going to hear a little bit of air in the sound, which means it's going to pick up a bit of distance from the snare drum. How high your overhead microphones are from your drum kit, and then how high your roof is from your overhead mics is going to make a massive difference to how the room sounds as well. In the room that I'm recording in today, it's actually quite a dead sound. which I personally quite like because it gives me a lot more chance to manipulate the drums after I've recorded them, rather than recording them in a huge room and getting reverb that I actually can't get rid of. Where in this situation, I can add reverb later and tailor it exactly how I want the drums to sound. So here's our snare drum sound with all 3 microphones in play. And now I want to show you guys a little secret technique when it comes to recording the top of the snare drum using a little pencil condenser. Now, taking my SM57 and my AKG 251 pencil condenser, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stick these microphones together and put them on the same stand. Now, once I record these 2 microphones together, I definitely have to make sure in my DAW whether I have phase aligned them correctly. The reality is I probably haven't put these 2 microphones together with their diaphragms exactly matching. So what I'm gonna have to do is go into the waveform, zoom right in and just see where the peaks are in that wave file on both of these microphones and making sure that those are right on top of each other. Let's check out how this combination sounds. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of ground when it comes to miking up a snare drum, treating the drum itself, different positions we can put our microphones in to get different sounds out of it. Now what I want to do is swap this drum out for a higher pitched drum and see if we can capture some really great samples to give to you guys in a bit. Okay, that's it for today's video. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and comment down below with what your technique is for miking up a snare drum. And if you haven't already, hit the red button and subscribe so you get told when new content becomes available. Also, I don't want you to leave empty-handed today. As you've just seen, I've recorded a whole bunch of different snare samples using this microphone configuration and different drums that I have in the room. And I want to give you guys the wave files for those samples to use in your own music. All you've got to do is head over to our website, thisisthesound.co, where you can sign up for our mailing list, and what will happen is you will get a link that will direct you to download these drum samples for free, so you can start using those in your music production today. Also in that free download section, there's a whole bunch of other drum samples that you can get, as well as vintage analog synth sounds for Logic and Ableton Live. Once again, thank you for joining me on this video. Make sure you subscribe so you get told about our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time. So here's our snare drum sound with all 3 microphones in play.